Welcome back to Ryan and Brian's Bible Bistro. I'm Ryan.
And I'm Brian.
And this is the Bible Bistro, a podcast all about the Bible, theology, and all things
related to the Christian faith.
That's right. We're back at it. Back at it today, Brian.
We are. You've had a little vacay.
I took a little bit of a vacation.
A little recreation, as we like to call it. So.
Is that what... Who likes to call it that? Whoever goes like,
I do.
I went on a recreation.
Recreation. I like the whole play on recreation.
Brian, I want you to know, in the time that we have done this podcast, you have never said, "Oh, I'm going to go on a recreation for a week." You say, "I'm going to go."
You never listen to what I say.
No, you said the word vacation. So went on a little vacation. Yeah,
nice.
So me and the missus.
Yeah,
we
the wait staff, as we like to call.
Oh my gosh. My lovely bride. Our anniversary is in July,
right?
But that's a very hot time, and our kids are out of school, so we decided we were gonna celebrate a little early here, and so we went to Florida for a week to celebrate our 20th year of wedded bliss.
Oh wow! Congratulations!
Yes, which means, and I've been looking at my transcripts recently, and I looked at the classes I had from you. I had you as a professor like 23 years ago, Brian.
Right? Wow.
Yikes.
So was it just one class or two classes you had me for?
I think I just had you for one class.
Okay. Was it Pauline Epistles?
It was. And I got a B in that.
Mm-hmm. For me, that's like a D minus.
All right. Well, here we are, everyone. So so we took a vacation, went to Florida, spent some time on the beach.
Good.
It was nice. Got too much sun. You know, it was Casper going out in the sun was not a good idea. UV index of 100 out there.
Oh, geez.
So anyway,
nice weather though. You said.
Oh, beautiful weather,
good.
Beautiful weather. But we're back. We're here. We did some reading and so forth. Have you been reading, Brian? Are you
a little bit? Yeah. So what? You had some recommendations, things you've been reading.
Yes, I just finished reading Jesus and the Powers by Michael Bird and
N.T. Wright. Yeah.
Tom Wright. Tom. For those who
call us Tom. Give us a call.
Whenever I text him, I say, "Hey, Tom." Michael Bird, it's a great book if you're interested in that. If you don't know, we are coming up on a time of election, and for those of you who don't know, and talking about
in the United States, we're talking about here.
Yes,
for
the
all
United States.
For all our foreign listeners.
Yeah. We are the center of the universe. We are Americans, after all. I'm teasing. That's a joke. That's why we're laughing.
Way to alienate every
No,
other.
it's not true. We're not true. But just talking about, it's good for anyone who lives anywhere that's ever a part of the world. Talking about what Jesus has come to do when it talks about Jesus defeating the powers. But then also, how do we live as Christians?
Right.
What is our responsibility? How do we interact with the world? How do we interact with government? And what is our responsibility in that? So. Read that.
Well, one of the things you asked me, I've been reading rereading commentary by Tremper Longman, a former guest here on the podcast, on the book of Genesis, as I'm preparing some sermons and that kind of thing. I've been doing some of that.
Tremper Longman, the third.
Yeah.
Not the second or the first, not the original, but
or the
third.
nothingth.
Or the nothingth, the OG Tremper. So you enjoying that?
Yeah, it's good. It's a good commentary. It's in the Story of God commentary series, which I really like.
Yes.
I really enjoy that. It's good, especially good for preaching. And you were talking about this book by James K. Smith too that you've been enjoying.
So I asked our missions pastor at our church, like I'm a big person. I want to ask I'm a big person in general, but I'm also a fan of asking people what they're reading. Because
you heard about the Daniel diet? Is that?
Yep. Yep. Anyway, thank you, Brian. I really appreciate that.
Just recommending some reading.
The Daniel, the Way Down Workshop. Anyway, don't do that. On the Road with Saint Augustine by James K. A. Smith.
Okay. I've seen that. I've seen that over the years. I'm
holding it up to the camera.
There it is.
I don't know if it's going to be reversed in the final video or not, or what it looks like.
So. Well, it isn't here. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know. Anyway, so he recommended that book, and I picked it up. And if you're not a huge theology reader or something like that, it's a really great book. I'm almost done with it. It's kind of a devotional, and it's making you think about some different things. He uses the story, kind of the St. Augustine's Confessions of St. Augustine, as kind of as a primer for the whole book, and it's really I think it's very insightful.
Cool.
It's not a hard read, but it's kind of
Right.
The Mission Scattered Church said, oh, you know, he reads it, you know, every year or so, helps him remind him of some things. So it's kind of a good little devotional thing. We'll put a link to that in the show notes.
Since you mentioned that, we've had some readers that have or some listeners who've been reading as well.
Yes,
has
purchased a couple books from the old bookstore.
Well, we've heard from some that are reading through Metzger's book on Revelation, which we've recommended during this series, and some have picked up Beale's shorter commentary and what was the other one? Kester's book, the Revelation, the End of All Things. So
yeah, so if you're reading
thanks
those,
for making those purchases through our website. Helps us out a little bit.
Yeah, and if we'd love to hear your feedback on those books. You know, like what you think about them, what have you liked, and so forth. And anyway, even if you haven't purchased a book from us, we'd love to hear your feedback on what you're liking or any questions you have in Revelation, because I think we've answered pretty much everything there is to answer in Revelation.
So I don't know that there's much left to do. So now that we completely understand the book of Revelation,
now we've got it all locked up. So all right, so we've talked, we've bantered, we've talked about all the things. Now, I mean, they're not listening just to listen to us talk.
Right.
Let's talk about
dig into these.
Yes.
So the seventh seal. We've been talking about the seven seals, and you know, I was thinking about this the other day. Probably even somebody who's only marginally aware of the book of Revelation, the seven seals, like you know, you'll hear people talk about this. Sometimes in the past, when I've been teaching Revelation, or somebody finds out I'm a New Testament scholar and I've taught Revelation, it's like, oh, what are the seven seals? Where do you think we are in the seven seals? You know, and so it's one of the more well-known images that we have. But I hope we've seen that it's really about kind of being faithful and maintaining our witness despite the persecution, the fact that God is going to make things right. But we've only gone through 6 seals, and then I'll remind you that was all the way back in chapter 6, so we finished that up. And then chapter 7, I called it kind of an interlude we looked at last time. Interlude, musical term, right? Well, I mean, you're the worship ministry major, so the idea of we have all this music that's kind of been going on, all these songs that are being sung, but then there's this interlude in chapter 7, and then we get to chapter 8, and the 7th seal is open. Now, the interesting thing about this, I've mentioned, and Metzger is the one who uses this image of a spiral, that we keep coming around to the same kind of topics. Book of Revelation probably should not be read completely linearly or chronologically, but is understood as kind of talking about the same themes in different ways. So kind of keeps coming back in a spiral manner. And one of the ways that I think this happens, and there's disagreements on this like there is about anything, is the 7th seal opens and we immediately begin another series of 7. So we're going to start that process today. Next week, we'll talk a little bit more about some of the 7 trumpets, but we open the 7th seal, and what we find inside is kind of another series of 7. At least they're connected in some way. So we're going to kind of introduce that. This is all Revelation chapter 8, verse 1. We kind of finished up with these songs in chapter 7. We found, you might remember, one of the elders kind of explains things to John, what he's seeing, and that was that kind of interlude. And now we have chapter 8 and verse 1 that shows the way that these trumpets are linked to the 7th seal. So go ahead and read verses 1 and 2, if you would, about the opening of the 7th seal. This is chapter 8, Revelation 8, verses 1 and 2.
When he opened the 7th seal, there was a silence in heaven for about half an hour. And I saw the 7 angels who stand before God, and 7 trumpets were given to them.
So a couple of interesting things happened. So do you remember what the 6th seal was? I know I'm putting you on the spot. It's been a couple of weeks. You were on vacay and all that, so you were in recreation. So, do you remember what the 6th seal was? What we had happen there?
The sun turned black like sackcloth. Right. Made of goat hair.
So there's all these images in the moon turns to blood. There's an earthquake. There's all these signs in the natural world, and especially the powerful. You know, it's everybody, but especially the powerfuls, the ones who are mentioned first, princes and kings and generals, are all begging the hills to fall on them and to hide them. So it's kind of an outpouring of the wrath of God against those who have acted against God's people. So you might remember the 5th seal is the slain saints under the altar who say, "How long, O Lord, faithful and true until you avenge our blood?" Then we find kind of that vengeance, that wrath coming in the sixth seal. And then we have the interlude. And then the seventh seal begins with silence. He opens it in silence for a half an hour in heaven. Now, this is kind of hard to understand. It's almost like a non-activity, and so we have to kind of think about that. I was thinking about, you're a well-known videographer and now a director of documentaries. So
all right, keep pouring it on me. Yeah, sure.
You think, and I've often said Revelation is a very it reminds me of a movie, like the language of images. Is what we have in the book of Revelation. And as a videographer, you know that images for us are kind of a language, especially in our culture. We're very visually oriented. How would you I was thinking about this, and I wanted to ask you, how do you depict silence in a movie? What would it indicate if you had a period of silence in a movie? How would you do that?
How I would do that is I would turn down the audio.
I was actually thinking that's not true, though. But hear me out for a minute. Go ahead.
I would say you turn it down, or like, how would you indicate silence?
Yeah, like what? And what would you be indicating by that silence? Was the other thing I was kind of.
I mean, it's dramatic.
Okay.
I mean, it's almost an uneasiness.
Okay.
Like it's the dramatic pause. Like you're like,
Right.
I'm expecting I should be hearing something, and yet there is nothing. I mean,
well, I know. Interestingly, we joke about crickets, but I know that sometimes you like in movies you hear crickets when it's like you're trying
you start to hear more of the ambient sound around you and less of like it's something directed at you.
And that's what I was thinking. I was thinking about some of the movies, especially maybe westerns or those kind of things, where you hear it's almost like a. You hear the wind, like like silence is indicated almost by you can't hear. There's no dialogue. There's we had a different thing because I'm thinking of silence as like pure little
lack
silence.
of, when someone's like you've seen this like in a war film when someone's yelling and there's no sound coming out, and it's like. It intensifies
That's true.
what you're seeing. So anyway, but yes, the ambient sound, sorry.
Yeah, ambient sound sometimes. Well, I was thinking like, if you're watching a movie and a couple of tumbleweeds, like in Western, a couple of tumbleweeds go through town, it's like nothing's going on.
It's a visual of desolation, like there's nothing there.
Desolation. That was kind of the word I was going for. And so that's one of the things. So after this complete, and I've suggested the sixth seal really is kind of the destruction of the world, like the end of the world.
That's it.
And then what do you have after that? Silence, right? And so that's one thing that this silence could indicate, kind of this idea that the judgment is over, and now we have, there's none of that happening anymore. It's interesting that it says that there is silence in heaven, because so far in the book of Revelation, let me ask you, what have we seen in heaven? What
worship?
Absolutely.
Constant, always singing.
And so from chapter 4 on, when it's, we kind of have this come up here, and John looks, and you mentioned this, he looks and he sees, and then he hears, and he hears worship. He hears the 4 living creatures that are around the throne, the 24 elders, and then a great multitude, all these noises of worship, these songs that are being sung, the praises that are being given, and all this kind of stuff. And so silence could indicate, there's a couple of really kind of cool things, and I'm going to give you some Old Testament scriptures here in just a minute, but it could be almost like an awestruck silence. You get what I'm saying? So you have this period of worship, and then at the end, there's nothing but just kind of standing in awe in the presence of God, especially. And again, I think it still has to do with this kind of idea that I'm going to use this language that we see with Jesus on the cross, right? But it is finished. Right, the judgment has been completed, and now there is silence. Now you were reading Kester's commentary on Revelation, which I've never read. This is in the is it the Anchor Bible series? No, it's
Yale
Bible series, commentary series, and I like Craig Kester a lot. But what he was saying something about the half hour here and the indication.
Yeah, so there was some indication. So we see the hour is referenced other times in Revelation. Like
Right.
this is the last hour and so
Right.
forth. And then we have this half hour. So there was some connection a little bit to even back to the Old Testament with the 3.5 years, like Elijah,
Right.
the drought and so forth, like this. This half,
2 times and a half time.
2 times,
Yeah.
times and a half. That this half is kind of like an kind of judgment interrupted, like it comes suddenly. It's kind of it's a something that's quickly coming.
All right.
That it's not for the full length, but it's for a time that there's a little bit of silence here. So
Almost kind of cut short.
yeah, almost kind of. I think he said
Okay.
like kind of judgment interrupted.
Okay.
There's a little bit of
Interesting.
silence there. So
Yeah, so this idea, so looking at what God has done, the judgment that's been brought upon those who caused harm to God's people, and then, like I said, maybe this awestruck silence of this lack of worship. There's a couple Old Testament passages I wanted to reference here. One of them is the book of Habakkuk, chapter 2 and verse 20, and it's kind of that idea of silence in the context of worship. And I especially like this. I want to say a little bit about, I don't think we're going to do an episode in this series on the temple imagery in Revelation, but here it is, the Lord is in his holy temple, let all the earth be silent before him. Mm-hmm. And so that's that kind of idea. If when God is in the temple on his throne, then let there be silence. And then the other one is Zechariah chapter 2 and verse 13. There it says, "Be still before the Lord, all mankind, because he has roused himself from his holy dwelling." There again, temple imagery. And so there is a time and a place for silence in the context of worship of God. So, we've had this constant kind of singing in these songs, and now there is silence. When we think about what comes next, so I'm going to give you a couple of different ideas, and I don't know, all these are not necessarily exclusive. It's not like you have to choose one or the other. I think these are, when you have silence, this is why I mentioned the idea of movies. When you have silence in movies, what are you trying to portray? What are you trying to say? So it's that same kind of thing. We're trying to think, what is John showing us by saying there was silence in heaven for half an hour? I think it's also interesting that it is trumpets that break the silence, right?
Yeah,
the next series of 7 is trumpets. And trumpets are one of the loud things, right? We're going to see their announcement. We're going to talk a little bit about what trumpets signify in the Old Testament as well. There's a context of worship for trumpets as well. But this silence is then broken by trumpets, which might even, how do I say this, put it into sharper relief, right, against the background of silence that you have the silence broken by trumpets.
yeah, you keep talking about me making videos. I think about, well,
You do. You make good ones.
yeah, I do. But it's one of the things is like when we conduct a lot of interviews with people, and after someone says something very dramatic, we will we'll break it up, because we will not put someone right next to them, because we want that moment to have its moment,
Right.
and that there's a time because there's a time of cognition that needs to happen. Like if someone says something very poignant or dramatic to it, like if you put something right up next to it, the thing that comes up right next to it, you lose the power of the moment,
right?
Because it's just stacked on. It's like it's constant.
It's
you lose that, but and as we're crafting a narrative, I mean, this goes true for training videos or fundraising videos. It's like there has to be a time for processing. There has to be a time for it to have the meaning that you want it to have, where you can, and then just as you talked about the trumpets, then you can come back and you can. The tone is changed. It's the same story, but the tone has changed, and so you can change the tone a little bit as we come into trumpets here.
See, this is the kind of thing I was looking for. This is exactly.
Once you finally explained yourself clearly, I knew how to talk about it.
Okay, I'm the problem. I can see this clearly.
As always.
So then the final thing I wanted to say is this. It could also serve to kind of conclude the judgment that's been brought by those in power. So kind of. And here's the image I like of this, and I was thinking about this series of 7. Of course, 7s go back. We talk about completion because they go back to the days of creation. And if you think about the 7th day of creation, it's a day of recreation, right? No, it's a day.
Just let it go, Brian.
It's a day of rest, right? It is a day of let's say stillness or silence. Not necessarily literally, but you get what I'm saying. You have all the activity of these 6 days, and it's the same kind of thing here. God brings his uncreation, the judgment on these and all the signs in the physical world. And then at the end of that series of 7, you have this silence in heaven for half an hour. So it could be that kind of an idea as well, kind of stopping, saying, as I mentioned earlier, kind of it is finished. The judgment has been accomplished. And then I was going to mention Zephaniah in this context. Be silent before the sovereign Lord, for the day of the Lord is near. The Lord has prepared a sacrifice, and he has consecrated or set apart those he's invited. So this idea of, again, being silent before God as he brings about his the completion of his work, so to speak. And then finally, it could be silence in preparation for an announcement. I was thinking, you do kids' church or children's church, right? Or,
I do. I do.
And it's kind of that, I don't know if they still do that, where everybody has to raise their hand, and you before you make an announcement, you want to make sure there's silence, right?
Yes.
And so that's kind of the idea here. So, any other thoughts on those first 2 verses of chapter 8? But those, that idea of silence and the opening of the 7th seal is kind of where I was wanting to go with this.
Yeah, it's it's kind of interesting to see that. To see that trend, that silence has always been interesting to me.
Yeah,
it's we've built up to this. We keep building and building and building, and where are we going with this? Like, what is this going to, and why the silence? Because I think it's, we talk about the sound of many rushing waters. We talk about the voice of God. I mean, this is and
trumpets
and trumpets. This is a place that's filled with sound and imagery, and then we get this pause. This very, it's like it's this pregnant pause. It's it's just it's almost the calm before the storm almost.
Take it in and stand in the presence of God kind of thing. And that's exactly, I think, what you said about when something very poignant or dramatic happens, you need time to step back. It's interesting. And the big debate here is whether or not the 7th seal, the content of the 7th seal is the silence, or if it is, like I said, I believe it's almost kind of nested here. The opening of the 7th seal leads to the trumpets. So the question is there anything in the 7th seal or not? And I'm kind of saying not really. It's opened, and then we have the silence. We're introduced to these trumpet playing band, so to speak, and that's what we'll look at next. Anything else? Did I interrupt you from some other thought?
Silence? No. I think it's I don't know. I think we're good.
Okay. Go ahead and read verses 3 through 5 then. This is Revelation 8 again, 3 through 5, if you read that for us.
Another angel who had a golden censer came and stood at the altar. He was given much incense to offer with the prayers of all God's people on the golden altar in front of the throne. The smoke of the incense, together with the prayers of God's people, went up before God from the angel's hand. Then the angel took the censer, filled it with fire from the altar, and hurled it on the earth. And there came peals of thunder, rumblings, flashes of lightning, and an earthquake.
You see this exactly the same way I do. That list is just so funny. It's like, and an earthquake.
Oh, just tag it on the end. Oh, I forgot. There's an earthquake.
But this is, again, there's so many images in the book of Revelation that I think are so powerful. And this again is another one of my favorite ones. I mentioned the slain saints in the altar. I've mentioned the lamb that's standing as one who's been slain in the center of the throne. This is another of my favorite images, this idea of the prayers of God's people going up, and then the censer full of wrath being thrown down upon the earth. So let's unpack this a little bit. We saw the slain saints under the altar, and I really like Beale's commentary. I do disagree with him a little bit on this. He thinks that what we have here in this altar is the same altar that we have there. I mentioned when we talked about that, I think that's the altar of burnt offering. I think, and that's kind of the idea. They have been offered as a sacrifice, right? That's where that would take place. And again, we really do need to do an episode just on this. I think it'd be really cool, because I think the entire temple is described here in this whole part of Revelation. And again, I think I said this either last time or 2 times ago, I can't remember, that I don't think this is John using the image of the temple. I think the temple's based upon the reality of what he sees here in the heavenly realms, right? The temple is an attempt to put into human size and human context the reality of what it means to be in the presence of God. Okay. So I kind of see this, this image isn't based on the temple. The temple's based on the image of what John is seeing here.
So
in this place.
this is a little Platonic, that the heavens are the form and that the temple is the
yeah. I
shadow.
mean, I don't want to get too Platonic with it,
right?
but
I'm just
I get what you're saying. It's that kind of, it is the real thing. The spiritual, the heavenly is the real thing, and what we see in the physical temple, and that's why I think God gets. Have you ever read the last half of the book of Exodus? Most people have not. It's very specific about how to build a temple, right? In that case, a tabernacle. Right? The size, the shape, the colors, the materials, the links. It goes into great excruciating. Literally half of the text of the book of Exodus is about how to build the tabernacle. Most people don't realize that.
And then we have spirit-enabled people to help build the Ark of the Covenant.
Yeah, I have to inspire people in order to actually be able to bring it about. Exactly. That's a great point. And so what I think we have happening is, I think we have the slain saints under the altar being under the altar burnt offering. I think this is the altar of incense. It talks about incense. It talks about the prayers of the people, and incense frequently is associated with prayers.
And kind of carrying the prayers up to
exactly.
To God.
Yeah, that's the image. As incense rises, it carries the prayers of God's people. It's a sweet smelling savor. Goes up before God. Luke chapter 1 is just an image of that. That's where Zechariah, the father of John the Baptist, you might remember, he's in offering, and that's what he's doing. He's standing in the incense. He's praying, and an angel Gabriel appears to him there as he's praying at the altar of the incense. I think it mentions Gabriel there. But it says in Luke chapter 1, I didn't look this up specifically, but it says in Luke chapter 1 that this is happening while all the people are outside praying, right? That he's offering this incense. That's what it's to carry up before God this prayer. Look again here. Did you still have Revelation 8 open, or I thought maybe you're looking at Luke 1?
He does reference Gabriel. So
is it Gabriel? Okay,
Gold star.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
We're going to mention all kinds of angels by name in a little bit. Revelation chapter 8, read just that. Where does it say this? Notice the position here. What does it say? The altar that is...
It's at the altar, on the golden altar in front of the throne.
In front of the throne. So the altar of incense would have been in front of the curtain that separated... It was in the holy place that separated the Holy of Holies from the holy place. And so the throne, I think, is represented by the Ark of the Covenant. We talked about this
God's
before.
presence is.
It is symbolic of the presence of God. It is interesting because it's an empty seat, right? It's like a place where you'd put an idol, but there's no idol there because God isn't represented by idols. So when it says before the throne, I think we're talking about the altar of incense. So it says, and notice it says much incense, right? It's a lot of incense that this angel is offering. This angel, by the way, well, we won't say too much more about it, but we do have from time to time these angels. There's one later that seems to very much be Christ. It would make sense. I'll put it at least this way, that this angel serves as a intercessor, right? Is interceding between God's people and the Father, right?
Yeah, God. He's the one that's carrying the people's prayers.
He's taking the people's prayers up to God, and then here's the image we can't miss. He takes that same censer, right, that held the incense for the prayers of God's people, and he scoops up coals from under the altar, and he casts them down, and it's gaze again. The word isn't cosmos, it's gaze, upon the earth, right? We talked about this before, the people of the earth, the citizens of the earth. And so this judgment, and that's what this censer is. And then again, we see these. I want to say these what's the word I'm looking for? These things that happen in the natural world. These the earthquake and everything that's taking place. But he cast them down upon the earth, and so here's what we can't miss. There's a direct connection
between the prayers
and the judgment, right? So this is another. Again, this isn't something that happens after the other stuff. This is another way, I think, to talk about the fifth seal and the sixth seal. This is the slain saints under the altar saying, "How long, O Lord, faithful and true, until you avenge our blood?" This is the prayers of the saints going up before God and saying, things are not the way that they're supposed to be. When are things going to be made right? Mm-hmm. And then the casting down of the coals is the same as the judgment we find, which comes upon the rulers of the earth in the sixth seal. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. So this is just another way to amplify that. And what I think is being emphasized is the direct connection, right, between the prayers of God's people and the judgment that goes down upon the earth. It's not that we're calling down judgment, right? Mm-hmm. But it is that the faithful, persevering prayers of God's people results in judgment being brought upon those who are bringing pain to them, the ones who are causing evil to be done to them. Mm-hmm. Any thoughts on that?
Well, part of my thoughts would be connected to next week's episode when we get into some of that other parts of it.
We can go ahead and say that. So the first four trumpets, interestingly enough, mirror the plagues that took place in Egypt. Mm-hmm. And so here's how I would say this. That is so. God's people in Egypt being oppressed by the Egyptians, being pressed into servitude, being pressed into slavery, is one example of the way that God's people were subjected to the rulers, right? Mm-hmm. And that has happened over and over again throughout history. That's one of the things that happens. And it's this. John is on the Isle of Patmos, exiled by the Roman government because of maintaining his testimony to the Word of God and to Christ, right? Jesus was subjected to the oppressing act of crucifixion, which was meant by the Roman government to be an advertisement for what happens when you oppose us, right? It was a public service announcement, right? Public in the sense that the crucifixion was a public spectacle along a major road. I just went through this again in my Sunday school class in John chapter 19. He was crucified. He was there along a road. And as the Jews are coming in for the Passover, they see that it's written King of the Jews. And they go to complain to Pilate, because they saw that's what is being advertised, right? Don't oppose Caesar. Don't oppose Rome, or this is what's going to happen to you. So anytime God's people are opposed in this way, God is able to respond to those who oppress them. Babylonians, the Assyrians, the Egyptians, the new Neo-Babylonians, right? Mm-hmm. The Romans, and any system of oppression that causes pain for God's people today, right, can be overthrown, and that's what I think this is the message of.
Okay. I got stuff to unleash for next week when we talk about.
Right.
Well, it's not unleashed, but there's a couple sentences next week that are just like rattling through my head real quick as we get into next week.
Hold on to them. Don't
I'm holding on to them.
Don't lose them.
My head's gonna explode. Too much coffee.
I'm trying to think if there's anything else. I think that was it. Oh, go back in Revelation. You can flip back a couple pages to Revelation chapter 5 and verse 8. Okay. The prayers of God's people is mentioned in this context as well, I think.
And when he had taken it, the 4 living creatures and the 24 elders fell down before the Lamb. Each one had a harp, and they were holding golden bowls full of incense, which are the prayer of God's people.
So there again, incense and the prayers of people are God's people are. By the way, we didn't talk about that image, but this again shows you need to understand these things symbolically. How do you play a harp if you're carrying a censer full of incense, right? But all this, the munch incense, the censers full of incense that we see there, it's just the number of prayers that are going up before God, and the way that God's people are just continually crying out to Him for relief and for help.
Yeah, I guess the thing that I think about with these prayers is kind of going. It's kind of comparing what the people want, what Christians want, what those slain saints on the altar want, and what God wants in this situation. I think we'll see as we kind of go into it. I'll kind of give a peek of how I read the next section, and you can tell me I'm wrong next week, of course.
No, I'm sure you're not.
But it's kind of saying like, oh, this is what you want, and God's giving the vision. If this is what you want, I'm going to show you what happens. If I just respond to what you want right now, here's what happens. Okay. But it's not going to have the response that I think that it's not going to be the response that is the one that God truly wants, or maybe even for them as Christians they should be wanting either. So
interesting. Okay,
that's kind of how I look at it. So that's why I'm like I'm trying to say something without talking about next week.
Well, again, it is the Egyptian plagues, and if you think about Egypt over and over again, they see these things, but continually Pharaoh hardens his heart. They continue to renege on their promises. And ultimately there are those who become believers in Yahweh because of the things that they see. But ultimately it doesn't buy them their freedom until we get to the very end. And even then we find the Egyptians changing their mind again and going after them. Yeah, that's a good point. I think I see where you're going. Where are you going?
Do you see where I'm going? We'll talk about it later.
I think so, yeah.
Before you have to correct me too much next week. Anyway, this is a short episode, but I think it's good.
Oh, we got one more verse.
We got one more verse. That's right. Let's keep going. Yeah.
We're going to take another half an hour on this. 8:6. Go ahead and read just 8:6. Yeah. And this is just introducing a couple of things here.
Then the 7 angels who had the 7 trumpets prepared to sound them.
Okay. What else can we say about this?
Silence.
Sure. Short answer.
No, wait, half an hour of silence, and then I'll stop the episode.
It's interesting, these 7 angels, and I want to say just a couple things about that. So again, 7 is the number of completion. Verses 2 and 3, or chapters 2 and 3 in the book of Revelation, we have this letters to the 7 churches, and you might remember that each of the churches, it mentions an angel or a messenger of the church. That the word angelos in Greek literally means messenger. That angelos is obviously where we get the word angel, and so they are the ones who are the intercessor, or the ones who are between God on the throne and His people in the church. Right? They are the ones who are acting on their behalf. As the Hebrew writer calls them ministering spirits, right, on behalf of God's people. They're the ones acting on our behalf. There's a long history during the intertestamental period of these 7 angels. I mentioned Gabriel earlier. So we have the 7 churches, but then this isn't the only time that we have had these 7 angels mentioned. And I want to read, be careful of this book. I actually had somebody ask a question about First Enoch last Sunday. And I mean, here's the fascinating thing about Enoch. First Enoch is written during the intertestamental period. It's 150 chapters long. It's not by Enoch, okay? Enoch, you might remember in the genealogy, is said to have, in the genealogy of Adam, so it goes back that far, it is said about Enoch that he walked with God and was no more. And so he's seen as someone, he's understood, and I don't know that this is what that verse is saying, but he's seen as someone who never tasted physical death. In other words, he was assimilated somehow into heaven with God. That's kind of the way he becomes understood. I'm not saying that's what that passage in Genesis is saying. I don't know what that passage in Genesis is saying, but he becomes a character of real interest because of that. And so there's all this literature that we call Enochic literature. Enoch is that guy. And just like we've talked before about apocalyptic literature, you always have this guide. And so Enoch becomes a guide because he's a human being, right? He understands us, but he has been assimilated into the heavenly realm somehow. So First Enoch is really a book that explains if you have any unanswered question about the Old Testament, it's probably answered in First Enoch, right?
Doesn't mean it's correct or accurate.
Exactly. And that's why people are so fascinated by it. And it is a fascinating book. I'm not saying don't read it. I'm saying it's not Bible, though. Right? It is not an inspired word of God.
Not canon, yeah.
Right. But what it does show us, so why read it at all, you might say? Well, what it does show us is that the way people were thinking about God and theology and
the spiritual realm
during the intertestamental period, so just prior to the time of Jesus. We mentioned, we actually had an episode on this in First Peter. We mentioned that our Second Peter and Jude both mentioned First Enoch. They both mentioned this book. But there's a passage, and it's actually all of chapter 20, that mentions these 7 angels by name. And so I'm just going to read this part of it because it kind of gives you the idea. These are the names of the holy angels who watch, sometimes called the watchers. Uriel, one of the holy angels, who's over the world and over Tartarus. Tartarus would be another way to talk about the realm of the dead. Raphael, and not one of the Ninja Turtles, one of the holy angels who is over the spirits of men. Raguel, who is an Italian angel. I was going to say. I'm going to quit it with it. Raguel. One of the holy angels who takes vengeance on the world of the luminaries. Michael, one of the holy angels, to wit, that is set over the best part of mankind and over chaos. Michael, of course, if you go back to our Daniel episode, is mentioned there, and we're going to see him mentioned later in the book of Revelation if we ever get to that part. But Michael is mentioned specifically in Scripture. Sarakiel, one of the holy angels who is set over the spirits and who sin in the spirit. Gabriel, one of the holy angels who is over paradise and the serpents of the cherubim. Remiel, one of the holy angels whom God set over those who rise. And if you count those are 7 names, right? Mm-hmm. Now, again, this is the book of First Enoch. Gabriel and Michael are both mentioned in Scripture. What?
It's just the Gabriel. I mean, can't I laugh at that? Like the way that you're saying that? Gabriel. I mean, you're correcting yourself.
That's how it's pronounced. But
what do you mean that's how it's pronounced?
That's how it's pronounced in Hebrew. Gabriel.
Gabriel.
Yeah, we say Gabriel. You think English people know how to speak Hebrew?
Whoa. The intensity. I was laughing at the Gabriel.
Okay. Gabriel and Michael. It technically would be Michael. I didn't say that, I guess, but
okay.
We say Michael. I don't know.
Afternoon anger from Brian.
But Gabriel. So Gabriel and Michael are both mentioned in Scripture. Mm-hmm. Gabriel, of course, is mentioned frequently. I'm going to keep saying it. I know.
I don't even smile anymore.
No acknowledgement. He has a lot to do with the birth of Jesus. We see him frequently mentioned in connection with the birth of Jesus. So these other names, again, are not attested in Scripture, but they become kind of, how do I say this? They become the standard during the intertestamental period of the way to talk about these 7 ministering angels. And Enoch is saying, this is, again, Enoch answers any question you might have. Well, this angel takes care of this, and this angel takes care of that, and that angel takes care of that. So again, I don't read this to say this is truth. I read this to say this is the way that people in John's time and before, during the time of Jesus, were thinking about those spirits who acted on behalf of God. 7, again, it's interesting that number that is mentioned here in connection with that. I want to go back, but again, I think the 7 angels that are mentioned, I think it's part of the reason we have the 7 churches, right? It's talking about the church as a whole, and these angels are the ones who are acting completely on behalf of God. I want to go back and talk about trumpets as well. Trumpets become connected even before the time of the book of Revelation with the second coming of Jesus. And I mentioned 2 Paul passages just to show you this quickly. We have taken this language on ourselves. But if you look at First Corinthians chapter 15, for example, verses 51 and 52, this is the long chapter on the resurrection, you might remember. Paul says there, "Listen, I tell you a mystery. We will not all sleep," meaning in death, I think. We will not all sleep, but we will all be changed in a flash, in the twinkling of an eye, at the last trumpet. For the trumpet will sound, the dead will be raised imperishable, and we will be changed. So this idea of the last trumpet is already one that we see before the time of the book of Revelation. First Thessalonians even, which is a very early epistle of Paul. 1 Thessalonians chapter 4 and verse 16 says, "For the Lord himself will come down from heaven with a loud command, with the voice of an archangel, and with the trumpet call of God, and the dead in Christ will rise first." So we've taken that image on, but it's one that we see clearly in Scripture. Trumpets are associated with Christ's return. And so these 7 trumpets, again, are kind of an announcement. It's kind of a... I was going to say a wake-up call, in the sense of the dead hear the trumpet, right, and they rise. It's kind of like a revelry, if you've been in the military, that sound you hear in the morning, that basically it's time to get up. So trumpets have some really interesting connotations. They're certainly, they're piercing. Their sound is piercing, right? It's something that can be heard from a long distance. And so trumpets are sometimes used in military engagements, which carry with it the idea that we're in a divine battle, right? That this idea of the final act in the battle between good and evil. We're going to have Armageddon later on in the book. We're going to have all these kind of images, battle images. So trumpets could have that connotation with it. I'm going to use a specific example in just a moment. Trumpets can also rally people together, and I mentioned here in the book of Isaiah. Chapter 27, it says, I'm just going to give you a couple of trumpet passages. "In that day, the Lord will thresh from the flowing Euphrates to the Wadi of Egypt." Thresh is a way to talk about harvest, right? It's the last stage of harvest. "And you, Israel, will be gathered up one by one, and in that day a great trumpet will sound. Those who were perishing in Assyria and those who were exiled in Egypt will come and worship the Lord on the holy mountain in Jerusalem." So you see what I'm saying? The trumpet kind of rallies people together. It's a way to call people together. And so when the Lord, kind of the image that Isaiah gives us is when the Lord returns, the trumpet's going to sound and people are going to come from all these exiled places. Thoughts on that or comments?
I think that's a pretty common. I mean, it's a common tool at that point, in warfare and so forth.
Sure.
That, it's something that was loud that could gather or signify something's happening.
Right. Another, I want to read, this is Joel, if you want me to keep mispronouncing names.
Billy Joel, yes.
Yoel. "Blow the trumpet in Zion, sound the alarm on my holy hill. Let all who live in the land tremble, for the day of the Lord is coming." So it can be an announcement, in this sense, kind of almost an alarm. The day of the Lord is coming, so you better watch out, right? You better be ready, is kind of that idea. Trumpets also are sometimes used to announce the arrival of an important person. Here again, I think about movies. If you think about an older movie, when somebody important is coming along, the king or whatever, you're going to have people, blowing those trumpets with the banners hanging down from them, that kind of thing. That kind of.
Yes.
That kind of. And then the final thing I wanted to mention, though, and this goes back to that idea of silence and the silence of worship and being awestruck before God. And I think this is a cool way to think about this, is that trumpets also have a role in worship. Trumpets were used, again, to call people together to be in the presence of God, and they were a way to enter into worship. You see this in the Psalms, for example, where it talks about trumpets being used in this manner. You have particular times when we looked at the book of Leviticus, there are particular times when trumpets are used in the context of worship, in the feasts, right, calling people together. And so that may be the kind of image, the way that these trumpets sound. I think the battle imagery is definitely a part of it as well, though, because we have, as you mentioned already, this idea of judgment. Mm-hmm. So, any other thoughts? I just made it longer. It's still a relatively short episode
for us. Probably. Yeah, it's not too bad. No, I mean, there's a lot happening here with these trumpets. That that there's multiple layers to it. The semantic range. It's not the semantic range of the word trumpet, but like it signals a lot. There's something that is happening. It can be a gathering. It can serve both purposes of gathering and then an impending judgment or battle that is announcement that there's a battle that is about to take place. So
I think it's an announcement. I think we have the silence, again, awestruck before God at what he has done. And then this idea of the trumpet sounding is an announcement of this activity of his judgment again. But yeah,
this is something that's going to be heard by everyone.
Yeah,
like
absolutely.
this is loud. This is not something you're going to be able to ignore. This is, and depending on who you are, it's going to mean different things. Right. You know, like it's going to have a different.
That's true. Just like the
different.
Just like the double-edged sword, or you know, to use the incense image again. This is what Paul says about them. For those who are being saved, the message that he's preaching is the you know, sweet smelling savor of incense, but for those who are lost, it's the odor of death. Mm-hmm. So yeah, it depends on your perspective in relationship to God, how you're going to hear these trumpets. Are they announcement of God's final act, and finally everything is going to be made right? And so we're looking forward to that trump sounding as we have in Paul. Or is this the announcement of doom for me? The one image I was thinking about, I didn't mention this, but you remember you know, if you think about Old Testament trumpet stories, one of the best, there's a couple of them. One of the best is the walls of Jericho. Mm. And that's a great example for what you just brought up. You might remember they march around the walls and they blow the trumpets, or carry the trumpets. The last day they march around 7 times. They blast the trumpets, and it's at the trumpet blast that the walls fall down. Defeat for the enemies of God's people, victory for God's people. So the trumpet announces both.
Right.
Yeah, depending on your
positionality to the, you know,
where you stand in relation to God. Absolutely. And that's the message of the book of Revelation. The one who remains faithful to the end will see life. So that's really kind of what we're getting at. So,
well, very good. Well, yeah. Brian, thanks so much.
Yeah. So I was going to say we've had some new listeners, we think, and so thanks for joining us. Let us know where you found us and what you think. Go on to your favorite podcast app and give us a rating and
Apple
a review.
Podcast, whatever. You can do that on your computer. I think you can do it on your phone as well. We'd love to hear from you. We've said this a couple times. We would absolutely love to hear from you. If you're a new listener, or you've been listening to us for a while and you've got someone on your mind, or you know, share an episode. You know, that helps us a ton. Lot. Just to you know, we put out stuff pretty regularly on Facebook and Instagram with new episodes. But the more that if you like us, you share us, you know, we can grow our audience there as well. So we really appreciate all of you that are sticking with us and are participating, and those of you that are reading, and we're excited to see, you know, some of those purchases, not just for us because we get cents on it.
We want to be a good resource for people to dig into Bible study and to think through some of these things. Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, you can find show notes on thebiblebistro.com. You can go there. This episode will be right there on the homepage if you're listening this week, but you can also go to the past episodes and find it, and you'll see, you can watch us there on YouTube. The link's right there. You can find links to books. We have the little bookstore on there as well. Or if you'd just like to support us on Patreon, you can do that as well monthly. So, Brian, I really appreciate it. I'm excited for this next one because I'm like, there's things I want to talk.
Why don't you just lead next week?
Yeah, maybe. Gabriel. What's up? I'm
Mikael.
teasing. Yes. Anyway, I'll say something and you can correct me. It'll be the joy of your day.
See you next week.
All right, Brian. Bye, Brian.